How I was kidnapped and neglected in Panama for 4 years. For my mom's whole life up to until she was 30 or so, she lived with her parents who were controlling and manipulative. When I turned 8, my mom finally found a relationship with somebody, but her parents weren't having it and would harass us and file court proceedings claiming her husband was a predator, which he wasn't, and also while she was with him she became pregnant with my sister, but for some reason my mom decided to divorce him under my grandpa's suggestion and move to Panama with them, in retrospect to isolate her and get control over her. For a while everything went well. I was in school, made a few friends, and gaming became a hobby, but after 6 months when my sister was born, my grandma said something about my other dad that pissed my mom off so much she snapped and moved out within an hour and told me I'd never get to live grandparents again. Being 8, this was very traumatic. She quickly rented a house and invited her divorced husband to Panama and remarried him, and life kind of returned to normal. For about 2 weeks. My grandpa caught wind of it and was so enraged he tried attacking my mom by breaking in, and I remember walking outside hugging my mom crying. Her husband arrived a little while later. Afterwards my mom took a taxi to David, picked her partner up and tried returning to a normal life. A week goes by, the police show up and tell us to get in the car and drive us over to court for seemingly no reason. At this point everything is a blur. I was interviewed by a psychologist, Lady Idk, and she began to cry, and me not knowing that my statements as an 8-year-old would determine what happens next, I thought everything was okay. And it should have been. The judge had been bribed. There was nothing on earth we could do. Men in black suits showed up, ripped my 3-month-old nursing sister from my mother's arms, grabbed me by the arms and legs and physically ripped me away from my mother, threw me into a van and drove me to Casa Hogar or Trisker, an orphanage with kids just like me. This was longest I'd ever been away from my mother and was extremely traumatic. The first thing that happened was a lady screamed, "Take my clothes off and get in the shower," which was freezing, and then got me dressed and left me in a large room with around 200 other kids watching the movie Trolls on repeat all day every day. I cried myself to sleep every night and prayed I would get out of there. Miraculously my mom got me out of there within a week but couldn't have custody of me, so she left me with a nice woman named Patsy. Again my grandparents found out what happened and began stalking us, and the lady got scared, and I think I somehow ended up at some resort place with my grandma since my mom had a protective order on my grandpa. I played Splane 10 every day and my mom had visitation rights. Here comes the absolute batshit crazy part of this story. One night my mom comes over and visits like usual, but unbeknownst to me and my grandma was that, I kid you not, a white van was sitting in the street. My mom grabs me by the arm in my pajamas into the pouring rain into a white van and drives off with her husband and a native guy to the San Blas Indian Reservation across the entire country on the border of Colombia. We made it all the way across the country, but we were wanted and got caught at a checkpoint. I think that was most terrified I've ever been. We got shipped back across the country in yet another white van. The native guy who helped us was put in prison. My mom also scarily was almost put in prison for 10 years for kidnapping her own children who were illegally taken from her. I then was returned to my grandmother and the protective order was lifted on my grandfather, and I moved to a secluded mountain coffee plantation 2,500 feet above sea level. In other words, I was back to where I lived originally when I moved to Panama. This is where everything became true suffering. I was put into a Spanish-speaking public school and drew for 8 hours a day and learned absolutely nothing, since the teaching must have thought I was lost cause, and this lasted 6 months. On a positive note, I met one of my 2 best friends, Christopher. But with any friendship at that age, you know things might get interesting. He introduced me to porn and I was a porn-addicted, human-trafficked, neglected 8-year-old now. My grandma pulled me out of that school and put me into a different one called the Oxford School, which actually spoke English. I was bullied there by a South African girl who was also ripped from her mother. I was too traumatized to learn anything, and also I think they gave up on me there too because they let me draw again for 8 hours a day. There I finished 2nd and 3rd grade and my grandma randomly pulled me out again and put me into homeschool. She essentially did my school for me 4th, 5th, and 6th grade, and still I learned absolutely nothing and would essentially game Roblox Phantom Forces FPS for 7-10 HRS a week up until my mom finally rescued me and my sister. Also keep in mind my sister was also neglected and had stunted development and severe tantrums due to her not nursing during her infant years, never being disciplined ever, and having very few friends. My mom fought desperately to regain custody, but the court was biased and my grandparents had more money. Tragically, one week my mom briefly left her husband to file legal paperwork and he was most likely murdered by a hitman that my grandpa hired. He said to my mom a while before, "See this number, it only costs $500 to hire a hitman in Panama sick." When my grandpa heard the news that this sexual predator had died of an apparent suicide, he was overjoyed and told me to be happy too. I was not happy, but I kept to myself. My mom was at this point emotionally broken. She'd lost her 2 babies for 2 years, lost her husband, spent thousands of dollars on lawyers who were fucking useless to fight a biased court which took bribes from my rich grandparents. She moved to a neighboring mountain town called Vulcan and met another victim of the Panamanian legal system who also lost custody of her kids but was trapped in Panama and still is to this day. Under her advice my mom traveled to the US just after the pandemic began to go to her last bastion of hope, the FBI. Even then it took years for her to finally get through to them, but in the meantime I still had 2 more years. My grandma signed me up for a carpentry class with a very odd 40-year-old man named Angelo Nelson, who coincidentally was the ex-husband of my mom's friend. Kid after kid kept joining, and one of the kids was a kid named Daniel who was older than me, and his dad was some pastor. Believe me, this kid was nasty. He bullied me worse than the girl before, beat me up, insinuated a diagnosed OCD complex about my intelligence or IQ by calling me all sorts of derogatory statements behind the teacher's back. For some reason I couldn't speak up for myself and endured this bullying for 2 years. At the same time, my grandma, looping back to the beginning, being an extremist evangelical herself, began indoctrinating my little 10-11-year-old brain all sorts of weird religious beliefs and extremes, like if I blasphemed the Holy Spirit. I know it sounds ridiculous, but I was 10-11 years old. I would go to hell forever, and I believed every word of it. Or another example of the many was when the only time I expressed my feelings to her about being depressed, she said I was demonized and forced me to cough into a bucket to cast out the devils. At this point I was completely numb emotionally, and my physical condition had deteriorated due to the constant 24/7 gaming addiction. But out of nowhere my grandma gets a call from the FBI that went somewhere along the lines of "give this bitch's kids back or we're launching a full-scale investigation." And just like after 4 years of constant suffering through the best years of childhood, many experiences I haven't talked about, I was back with my mother and fled the country of Panama to the United States. Summarized, when I got all the emotions built up for so long released themselves, and I got severe religious and IQ-based OCD which was left untreated for 3 months. I couldn't eat, sleep, shit or anything else cause I'd contort myself and shriek in agony and stared blankly into nothing for hours because some voice in my was like, if you touch that tile you'll go blaspheme the Holy Spirit and you'll never be forgiven, etc. My sister still has issues as well as my mom, which I'm not trying to minimize. All this is my summarized experience and nothing more.